April 1876. A man with ruined lungs receives a simple medical order: complete rest, mild climate, quiet life. He chooses the opposite. He chooses altitude. He chooses work that crushes. He chooses El Paso County, Colorado, where the air is too thin to breathe right, and the land too hard to break alone. He goes because he'd rather die trying than rot obeying. The doctor warns him. His family begs. He leaves anyway, and when he coughs blood for the first time under the Colorado sun, he understands a truth no one told him. The West doesn't cure anyone. It only reveals who you are when no one's watching anymore. 12 months separate Orrin Maddox from proof of residence. But the altitude, the winter, and his own body have other plans. Before we go any further, tell me something. Where are you watching this from? City and country. I read every comment. Orrin Maddox was 28 years old when Dr. Abner Fitch told him he was dying, not dying fast, dying slow, the kind that takes years if you're careful, months if you're not. Tuberculosis, consumption, whatever name you gave it, the result was the same: blood in the lungs, weakness in the limbs, and a future measured in breaths instead of years. Dr. Fitch had seen it before. He'd seen it 100 times, and he knew what came next: rest, warmth, no exertion, no excitement, no life worth living, if Orrin was being honest. The examination room in Pittsburgh smelled like carbolic acid and old wood. The walls were papered in faded green. Outside, the April rain drummed against the window in a rhythm that felt like a countdown. Dr. Fitch sat across from him, hands folded on the desk, expression practiced and clinical. He didn't waste time with false hope. He told Orrin what he needed to do: stay indoors, avoid cold, avoid strain, eat well, rest often, live quietly, and maybe, he'd see 40. Orrin nodded. He thanked the doctor. He paid the fee with money he didn't have. And then he walked out into the rain and made a different decision entirely. He didn't go home that night. He walked the streets until his coat was soaked through and his boots were heavy with water. Pittsburgh in 1876 was a city of iron and smoke, of foundries that ran all night, and rivers that reflected nothing but soot. He'd been born there, raised there, worked there since he was 14, first in the rail yards, then in a printing house that paid just enough to keep him alive, but not enough to let him forget he was poor. His mother had died 2 years prior, his father before that. He had a sister, Nora, married to a clerk, living in a narrow house on the south side, with 2 children, and a husband who looked at Orrin like he was already a burden. There was nothing holding him there. Nothing but habit and the slow, predictable collapse of a body that had already decided to betray him. So he made a plan. Not a good one, not a safe one, but a plan that felt like choosing instead of surrendering. He'd heard about the Homestead Act. Everyone had. 160 acres of land, free, if you could prove up on it. 5 years of residence, improvements, cultivation. It sounded like a fairy tale to men like him. Men with no money, no family land, no future sewn up in someone else's will. But it was real, and it was open, and the Western territories were calling for settlers the way factories called for labor, loud, desperate, indifferent to who answered. Orrin didn't want to farm. He didn't know the first thing about soil or seed or irrigation, but he wanted space. He wanted silence. He wanted to die. If he was going to die, somewhere that didn't smell like coal smoke and someone else's future. He wanted to go west, not for health, not for hope, but because the alternative was a rented room and a slow drowning in a city that had already forgotten him. By the end of April, he'd sold everything he owned: a trunk of clothes, his father's watch, a few books. It came to $32. He bought a train ticket to Denver for $18. The rest went into his pocket, folded tight, wrapped in oilcloth, kept close. He told Nora he was leaving. She cried. She begged him to stay. She said he'd die out there alone. He told her he'd die here alone, too. At least out west, he'd die on his own terms. She didn't understand. He didn't expect her to. He left Pittsburgh on May 3rd, 1876. The train pulled out at dawn, and he watched the city shrink behind him until it was nothing but smoke on the horizon. He didn't look back after that. The journey west was 3 days of hard seats, stale air, and landscapes that shifted like stages in a play. First the green hills of Pennsylvania, then the flatlands of Ohio and Illinois, stretching out in fields of young corn and empty sky. Then the plains, vast, rolling, relentless. The train rocked and rattled. The coal smoke seeped in through every crack. Orrin sat by the window and watched America unroll itself in silence. His chest ached. His breathing was shallow. Every cough brought a taste of copper. But he didn't let himself think about it. Not yet. Not while there was still distance to cover. Denver came into view on the morning of May 6th. The mountains rose up in the west like a wall, snow-capped and brutal and impossibly close. The air was thinner here. He felt it immediately. Each breath required effort. Each step up the platform left him dizzy. The altitude pressed down on him like a hand on his sternum. He stood on the platform with his single bag and his $32 reduced to $14, and looked at the city sprawling out before him. Raw, loud, half-built, full of men who looked like they'd come west for the same reason he had. Because there was nothing left behind them worth staying for. He didn't stay in Denver long, just long enough to learn that El Paso County, south of the city, still had unclaimed land, just enough to buy a map, a canteen, and a wool blanket, just enough to board a southbound stage that rattled and bucked over roads that barely deserved the name. The stage let him off in Colorado Springs on May 8th. The town was small, new, dry as bone. The land office was a single-room building with a clerk who looked half asleep and a ledger thick with names. Orrin walked in with his remaining money and his last shred of optimism. He filed a claim. 160 acres, 10 miles east of town, near Fountain Creek. The filing fee was $14. He signed his name. The clerk stamped the paper, and just like that, Orrin Maddox owned land. Not owned exactly, not yet, but claimed, promised, his if he could survive it. He walked out of that office with a receipt, a hand-drawn map, and $2 left to his name. The sky above Colorado Springs was blue and endless and indifferent. The wind came down off the mountains cold and sharp, carrying dust that stung his eyes. He stood there on the dirt street, lungs burning, head light, and felt the weight of what he'd just done settle onto his shoulders like a yoke. He had no tools, no horse, no cabin, no water source he could count on, no neighbors he knew, no experience, no plan beyond survive 12 months and prove up. He had tuberculosis, $2, and a piece of paper that said he owned dirt he'd never seen. He looked east, toward the claim, toward the land that was supposed to save him, or kill him, or maybe both. And he started walking. The land was worse than he'd imagined. Orrin reached the claim on foot just before sunset, legs aching, chest tight, vision swimming at the edges. 10 miles had felt like 50. The altitude made every step a negotiation. His lungs pulled at air that didn't satisfy. His heart hammered in his chest like something trying to break free. By the time he crossed onto what the map said was his property, he was coughing so hard he had to stop and brace himself against his knees, gasping, tasting iron. The land stretched out flat and pale under the dying light. Scrub grass, patches of bare earth, a few scattered junipers twisted low by wind. No trees tall enough for timber, no stream he could see, just open ground that rolled gently toward distant hills, empty and silent except for the wind. The soil was hard-packed, sun-baked, the color of old bone. He knelt down and dug his fingers into it. It didn't give easy. He'd need a plow or dynamite or a miracle. He had none of those things. What he had was $2, a wool blanket, a canteen half empty, and the clothes on his back. The sun dropped below the horizon fast, the way it does on the plains, and the temperature fell with it. Orrin stood alone in the center of his 160 acres and realized he had no shelter, no fire, no food, no plan for the next 10 minutes, let alone the next 10 months. He walked until he found a low spot where the wind wasn't so brutal. He spread his blanket on the ground. He lay down on land that was legally his and felt like a stranger's grave. The sky above him was black and wide and crusted with stars so thick they looked like salt spilled across velvet. He'd never seen a sky like that in Pittsburgh. He'd never seen silence like this, either. It wasn't peaceful. It was enormous. It pressed down on him the way the altitude did, filling his ears with his own heartbeat, his own breath, his own smallness. He didn't sleep much that first night. The cold came in hard after midnight, creeping through the blanket, through his coat, into his bones. He curled tight and shivered and coughed, and told himself he'd made the right choice. He told himself that over and over until the words lost meaning. By dawn, he wasn't sure he believed it anymore. But belief didn't matter now. He was here, and here didn't care what he believed. Morning came pale and cold. Orrin sat up stiff, every joint protesting, and looked at his land in full daylight. It looked even less forgiving than it had the night before. He needed water first. That was the only certainty. He walked the property slowly, scanning for any sign of moisture, any dip in the ground that might hold a seep or a spring. He found nothing. The map had marked Fountain Creek to the west, maybe 2 miles off his claim. That would have to do. He walked there with his canteen, filled it from the slow brown water, and walked back, 4 miles round trip. His legs burned, his lungs screamed. He had to stop 3 times to catch his breath, bent double, coughing into his sleeve. When he made it back to his claim, he sat down hard and drank half the canteen in one go. The water tasted like minerals and grit. It didn't matter. It was water, and water meant he could stay. But staying required more than water. It required shelter. The land office required proof of residence, and that meant a structure. It didn't have to be much. Just 4 walls and a roof. Just something that proved intent. Orrin had no lumber, no nails, no tools. He had $2. He walked back into Colorado Springs the next morning, legs still shaking from the day before, and found a mercantile that smelled like leather and kerosene. The man behind the counter looked him over with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen 100 desperate men that month alone. Orrin asked what $2 could buy. The man didn't laugh, but it was close. He sold Orrin a handsaw, 6 nails, and a coil of thin rope. That was it. $2 gone. Orrin walked out with tools that wouldn't build a chicken coop, let alone a cabin, and the sinking understanding that he'd miscalculated badly. He went back to the claim and started anyway. There were no trees on his land, but there were junipers, twisted, low, dense. He spent 2 days cutting limbs with the handsaw, hands blistering, shoulders burning, lungs rattling like broken machinery. He dragged the limbs into a pile near the low spot where he'd slept that first night. He dug a shallow trench in a rectangle, 8 feet by 10, the best he could manage, and set the thicker branches upright in the dirt, lashing them together with the rope. It wasn't a frame. It was barely a suggestion, but it was something. He wove thinner branches horizontally, filling gaps, creating walls that wouldn't stop wind but might slow it. He had no roof, no door, no floor but dirt. He covered the top with his blanket, weighted down by rocks, and called it shelter. It looked like something a child would build, but it kept the worst of the wind off, and when the land office inspector came, if he came, Orrin could point to it and say he'd built a dwelling. It was a lie, but it was a lie the West understood. By the end of May, Orrin had a structure that barely deserved the name and a routine that kept him alive. Wake at dawn, walk to Fountain Creek for water, return, rest, work on the shelter, rest again, walk back to the creek before dark, drink, sleep, repeat. The altitude never let up. Every task required twice the effort it should have. His body was failing him in slow, compounding ways. The coughing grew worse. His appetite disappeared. He grew thin. His hands shook. At night, he lay in the juniper lean-to and listened to his own breathing, shallow and uneven, and wondered how long he had. He didn't let himself think about Pittsburgh, about Nora, about Dr. Fitch's office and the look on the man's face when he'd said rest. He'd chosen this, chosen altitude and isolation and hard ground, and now he had to live with it. June came in hot and dry. The wind picked up, constant and gritty, carrying dust that coated everything. Orrin's skin cracked, his lips split. He learned to wrap his face in cloth when he worked. He learned to move slowly, to conserve breath, to stop before his vision darkened. He learned the shape of his limitations. The land demanded planting if he wanted to prove up properly, so he tried. He had no seed, no plow, no knowledge, but he found wild grass near the creek and transplanted clumps of it near his shelter, digging with his hands, patting dirt over roots, hoping something would take. It didn't. The soil was too poor, the sun too brutal. Within a week, the grass had browned and died. He tried again. Same result. He gave up on cultivation and focused on survival. By mid-June, he was out of money, out of food, and out of easy options. He'd been eating hardtack he'd bought in Denver, rationing it down to nothing. Now there was nothing left. He walked into town again, this time looking for work. Anything. Day labor, hauling, cleaning. The men in Colorado Springs looked at him the way men look at ghosts. Pale, thin, coughing into his fist, eyes too bright. No one wanted to hire someone who looked half dead already. He spent 2 days asking, 2 days hearing no. On the third day, a man loading freight onto a wagon took pity on him. He paid Orrin 50 cents to stack crates for 3 hours. Orrin took it. He stacked until his arms gave out and his lungs filled with fire. He took the 50 cents and bought cornmeal and a tin of lard. It would last a week if he was careful. He walked back to his claim, legs trembling, and cooked cornmeal mush over a fire he built from dried grass and juniper bark. It tasted like ash. he ate it anyway. The loneliness was worse than the hunger, worse than the altitude. Orrin had expected isolation. He'd wanted it, even. But wanting silence and living inside it were different things. There were no neighbors within 5 miles. No one passed by. No one checked on him. The days bled together in a haze of heat and dust and effort that went nowhere. He talked to himself sometimes, just to hear a human voice. He argued with the wind. He counted stars. He measured time by the position of the sun and the depth of his own exhaustion. And slowly, without noticing exactly when, he began to understand what the West really was. It wasn't freedom. It wasn't opportunity. It wasn't the fresh start people talked about in newspapers and land office pamphlets. It was a test, a silent, indifferent test. And most people failed it. Late June brought the first real hint that he might fail, too. He was hauling water from the creek, canteen slung over his shoulder, when the coughing started and didn't stop. He dropped to his knees in the dirt, body convulsing, chest heaving, and when he pulled his hand away from his mouth, it was red, bright red, fresh blood, not the trace amounts he'd been spitting since Pittsburgh. This was different. This was his body giving up. He stayed there on his knees, staring at his palm, feeling the sun beat down on his neck and the wind pull at his hair. He'd known this was coming. Dr. Fitch had told him. The altitude would make it worse. The exertion would accelerate it, but knowing and seeing were different things. He wiped his hand on his pant leg. He stood up slow. He kept walking, because what else was there to do? July came in like a furnace. The sun hung white and merciless over the plains, baking the ground until it cracked. The air shimmered in waves that made the horizon look liquid. Orrin's shelter, if it could still be called that, offered almost no relief. The juniper branches had dried and shrunk, pulling apart at the seams. The blanket roof sagged in the middle, collecting dust. Inside, the heat was stifling. Outside, the wind offered no comfort, only grit and glare. He spent the afternoons lying in the thin shade of his structure, conserving energy, waiting for the temperature to drop enough that movement didn't feel like suicide. The blood came more often now. Not every day, but often enough that he stopped being surprised by it. He'd cough into his hand, see red, wipe it on his pants, and keep going. There was a rhythm to it, a terrible, predictable rhythm. Work until the coughing started, rest until it stopped, repeat. He told himself he was adapting. He told himself his body was learning the altitude, the heat, the demands. He knew it was a lie. But lies were easier than the truth. He needed money. The cornmeal was gone. The lard, too. He'd eaten the last of it 3 days prior, scraping the tin with his finger, licking it clean. His ribs showed through his shirt now. His belt had to be pulled 2 notches tighter than when he'd arrived. Hunger wasn't sharp anymore. It was dull, constant, a low hum beneath everything else. He walked into Colorado Springs again, 10 miles under a sun that felt like punishment, looking for work. This time he found it. A man named Tobias Kern ran a small freight operation out of a warehouse on the edge of town. He needed someone to load wagons. The pay was $1 a day. Orrin took it without negotiating. He worked 4 days straight, lifting crates, stacking sacks of grain, hauling barrels. The work destroyed him. Each day he came back to his claim barely able to stand, lungs shredded, hands bleeding from splinters and rough wood. But he had $4. $4 meant food, meant another week, meant he could stay. He bought flour, salt, a small sack of beans, and a chunk of salt pork. He carried it all back to the claim in a burlap sack, slung over his shoulder, the weight of it pressing into his collarbone until it left a bruise. When he reached his land, he set the sack down carefully, like it was something sacred. In a way, it was. It was proof he could survive, that he wasn't done yet. He built a fire that night and cooked beans in a tin cup, mashing them with a stick, eating them with his fingers. They were the best thing he'd tasted in weeks. He ate slowly, savoring every bite, and felt something close to hope. It didn't last. The next morning he woke to find a man standing near his shelter. Orrin scrambled to his feet, heart hammering, instinctively reaching for something to defend himself with. There was nothing. The man held up a hand, calm, unbothered. He was older, maybe 50, with a face carved deep by sun and wind. He wore a broad hat, canvas pants, boots caked in dust. He didn't look threatening, just curious. His name was Caleb Stroud. He lived 6 miles west, closer to the creek. He'd seen smoke from Orrin's fire and rode over to see who'd claimed the land. Orrin stood there in his torn shirt and 2 loose pants, still coughing from sleep, and felt the weight of being seen, really seen, for the first time in weeks. Stroud didn't say much. He looked at the juniper lean-to, at the fire pit, at Orrin. He asked how long Orrin had been there. Orrin told him, 2 months. Stroud nodded slowly. He asked if Orrin had water. Orrin said he hauled it from the creek. Stroud nodded again. He asked if Orrin knew what he was doing. Orrin didn't answer. The silence stretched. Finally, Stroud said if Orrin needed help, he should come by. He gave rough directions to his place. Then he mounted his horse and rode off without waiting for a reply. Orrin stood there long after Stroud disappeared, staring at the empty horizon. The encounter had shaken something loose in him. Not gratitude, exactly. Something closer to shame. Stroud had looked at him the way you look at someone who's failing. And Orrin knew he was right. He was failing. Slowly. Quietly. But failing all the same. He told himself it didn't matter. Told himself he didn't need help. Told himself he'd come out here to be alone. And alone was what he'd gotten. But the words felt hollow. He didn't go to Stroud's place. Not that day. Not the next. Pride kept him away. Or maybe it was fear. Fear that accepting help would mean admitting he couldn't do this. That the West had already beaten him. That Dr. Fitch had been right all along. By late July, the heat had settled into something permanent and oppressive. The days blurred together. Orrin worked when he could. Hauled water. Tried to improve the shelter. Tried to keep the fire going. Tried not to think about how little progress he was making. The claim looked the same as it had in May. Barren. Empty. A handful of dead grass transplants, and a structure that wouldn't survive the first real storm. He had nothing to show for 2 months of suffering, except a piece of paper that said he'd filed. And that paper meant nothing if he couldn't last 12 months. He lay awake at night, staring up through the gaps in the juniper roof, at stars that didn't care whether he lived or died, and felt the full weight of his mistake. He'd come west to escape, to choose his own death instead of having it handed to him in a rented room. But now, lying on hard ground with blood on his lips and hunger gnawing at his gut, he wondered if he'd just traded one kind of slow dying for another. At least in Pittsburgh, he would have had a roof, a bed, someone to find the body. August arrived with thunderstorms that rolled across the plains like distant artillery. Orrin watched them from his shelter, saw the lightning crack the sky in half, heard the thunder shake the ground. But the rain never reached him. The storms broke apart before they arrived, scattering into nothing, leaving only wind and the smell of wet earth that never came. The drought deepened, the creek level dropped, the grass turned brown, the land looked like it was dying too. Orrin felt a kinship with it, both of them drying out, both of them holding on by sheer stubbornness. One morning in mid-August, he woke to find his hands shaking so badly he couldn't hold the tin cup steady. He tried to boil water for coffee, real coffee, a luxury he'd bought with his last 50 cents, and spilled half of it into the fire. He sat down hard, breathing shallow, vision narrowing, and realized he was running out of time, not in months, in weeks, maybe days. He needed help. He hated admitting it, hated the weakness it implied. But survival didn't care about pride. He waited until the shaking stopped, until he could stand without his legs buckling, and then he started walking west, toward Caleb Stroud's place, toward the first offer of help he'd received since leaving Pittsburgh. The walk took longer than it should have. He had to stop twice to rest, sitting in the dirt, coughing into his sleeve, tasting copper. By the time he reached Stroud's property, the sun was high and brutal, and his shirt was soaked through with sweat. Stroud's place wasn't much. A low cabin, sod walls, shingled roof, a small corral with 2 horses, a garden plot with rows of something green, squash maybe, or beans. It looked like civilization compared to what Orrin had. Stroud was outside, repairing a section of fence. He looked up when Orrin approached, no surprise on his face, like he'd been expecting this. Orrin didn't say much, just that he needed work, that he'd do anything. Stroud looked him over, slow and measuring, and then nodded. He said he could use help with the irrigation ditch. It needed clearing. The pay was $1 a day, same as the freight work, but Stroud would throw in a meal. Orrin agreed. He worked that afternoon until his hands bled, and his chest felt like it was caving in. Stroud didn't push him, didn't ask questions, just let him work at his own pace, and then called him inside when the sun started to drop. The cabin was small, dim, cool. Stroud's wife, a quiet woman named Mary, maybe 40, with kind eyes and rough hands, set a plate in front of Orrin without a word. Beans, cornbread, a piece of bacon. Orrin ate slowly, mechanically, and felt something inside him crack. Not break, just crack, enough to let a little bit of the loneliness out. He worked for Stroud 3 more days that week. The work was hard, but manageable. Stroud didn't treat him like he was fragile, but he didn't push him past his limits either. And every evening, Mary fed him. She never asked why he was so thin, why he coughed so much, why his hands shook. She just fed him, and Orrin, who hadn't spoken more than 10 words to another person in 2 months, found himself talking. Not about the tuberculosis, not about Pittsburgh, but about small things, the weather, the land, the claim. Stroud listened, offered advice when it seemed useful, told Orrin he'd need to dig a well if he wanted to make it through winter, told him the juniper shelter wouldn't hold up past October, told him he'd need to think about food storage, about firewood, about 100 things Orrin hadn't considered. It wasn't kindness exactly. It was the practicality of men who knew the West didn't care about good intentions. On the 4th day, Orrin coughed so hard he had to stop mid-swing, dropping the shovel, bending double. Blood came up in a thick clot. He spat it into the dirt and wiped his mouth, breathing ragged, vision swimming. When he looked up, Stroud was watching him, not with pity, not with disgust, just watching. Stroud didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he asked, quiet and direct, if Orrin was sick. Orrin nodded, Stroud asked if it was consumption. Orrin nodded again. Stroud looked at him for a long time, expression unreadable. Then he said Orrin was a damn fool for coming to altitude with bad lungs. Orrin laughed. It came out bitter and sharp. He said he knew. Stroud asked why he came anyway. Orrin didn't have a good answer. Or maybe he did, but it was too complicated to say out loud, so he just said he didn't want to die in a city. Stroud nodded like that made sense, like maybe he understood, and then he went back to work. That night, lying in his shelter under a sky gone black and heavy with stars, Orrin thought about what Stroud had said. Damn fool. Yeah, that was accurate. He'd come west with tuberculosis, no money, no skills, and no plan beyond don't die immediately. And now, 3 months in, he was barely holding on. The blood was coming more often. His weight was still dropping. The altitude was crushing him the same way Dr. Fitch said it would. He hadn't gotten stronger. He'd gotten weaker. And winter was still months away. But he was still here, still breathing, still waking up every morning on land that was his. Even if it was killing him, that had to count for something. It had to. September came in cooler. The mornings carried a bite that hadn't been there in August. The light changed too, slanting lower, turning the plains gold in the early hours and deep orange at dusk. Orrin felt the shift in his bones, felt the promise of what was coming. Winter. The word sat in his mind like a stone. He wasn't ready, not even close. The juniper shelter wouldn't survive the first snow. He had no firewood stockpiled, no food stored, no well dug. No winter clothes beyond the coat he'd worn from Pittsburgh, already worn thin at the elbows. He had a claim and a receipt, and 3 months of survival that felt more like luck than skill. And now the season was turning. The clock was ticking. He had to move faster, had to do more, but his body had other ideas. The coughing grew worse as the weather cooled. Every morning he woke to it, chest heaving, lungs pulling at air that felt thinner than ever. The blood came almost daily now. He stopped trying to hide it, stopped pretending it wasn't happening. He just spat into the dirt and kept moving. Stroud had offered him more work, and Orrin took it. 2 days a week, clearing ditches, mending fence, hauling stone. It wasn't charity. Stroud needed the labor. But it kept Orrin fed, kept him from disappearing entirely into the isolation of his own claim. And Mary's cooking, simple, hot, filling, kept him alive in ways he couldn't quite articulate. He didn't talk much when he was there, just worked, ate, listened to Stroud talk about weather patterns, about soil, about the men who'd filed claims and abandoned them before the first winter hit. Stroud said the land had a way of sorting people. The ones who stayed weren't necessarily the strongest, just the most stubborn. Orrin thought about that a lot. Stubborn. That's what he was. Not brave, not resourceful, just too proud to quit, too ashamed to go back. He'd left Pittsburgh because staying felt like surrender. And now he was out here, coughing blood into the Colorado dirt, because leaving felt like the same thing. So he stayed. He worked on the shelter when he had the strength, reinforced the walls with more juniper branches, tried to patch the roof with strips of canvas he'd bought in town, with money from Stroud. It wasn't much, but it was something. He dug post holes for a proper frame, thinking maybe he could build walls that would actually hold. But the ground fought him, hard-packed, rocky. Every shovelful felt like breaking stone. He worked in short bursts, resting between, coughing into his sleeve, tasting iron. By mid-September, he'd managed to set 4 corner posts. It looked pathetic, but it was progress. The loneliness came back heavier in the fall. The land felt bigger somehow, emptier. The silence pressed in on him at night, broken only by wind and the occasional cry of a coyote far off in the dark. He thought about Pittsburgh more than he wanted to, about Nora, about the narrow streets and the factory whistles and the life he'd walked away from. He wondered if she thought he was dead, wondered if anyone did. He hadn't written, hadn't sent word. What would he say? That he was dying slower than expected? That he'd traded a rented room for a dirt floor and called it freedom? He had no words for what this was. No way to explain it that didn't sound like madness. So he stayed silent, and the silence became part of him. In late September, a cold snap hit. The temperature dropped, overnight, hard and fast. Orrin woke to frost on the ground, his breath misting in the air, his fingers numb, even inside the shelter. He tried to start a fire and couldn't get his hands to work right. They shook too much. The flint slipped. The tinder wouldn't catch. He sat there in the cold, fumbling, failing, and felt something close to panic rise in his chest. If he couldn't start a fire now, in September, what would happen in December, in January? He forced himself to slow down, to breathe, to try again. It took 20 minutes, but he got it lit. The flames were small, weak, but they were there. He crouched close, hands outstretched, and felt the heat seep into his skin. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was what he had. October brought the first snow. Not much, just a dusting that melted by noon. But it was a warning. Orrin stood outside his shelter and watched the flakes fall, slow and silent, settling on the dead grass and bare ground. Beautiful. Deadly. He thought about the men Stroud had mentioned, the ones who filed and left, the ones who looked at their first winter and decided it wasn't worth it. He understood them now. Understood the calculus. Survival versus pride. Warmth versus ownership. Going back versus dying alone. It wasn't an easy choice. It was just a choice, and every man made it in his own time. Orrin hadn't made his yet, but he could feel it coming, could feel the question forming. Not if he would leave, but when. He went to Stroud's place that week, walking through cold that made his chest ache and his breath come short. Stroud was outside splitting wood, steady and methodical, the axe falling in a rhythm that sounded almost musical. Orrin watched for a moment, then asked if Stroud had extra work. Stroud paused, axe resting on the stump, and looked at him. Really looked. Orrin knew what he saw. A man 20 pounds lighter than he should be. Skin pale, eyes too bright, coughing every few minutes. A man barely holding on. Stroud didn't sugarcoat it. He said Orrin looked like hell. Said he didn't think Orrin would make it through winter. Said it flat, without meanness, just stating a fact. Orrin didn't argue. He asked if that meant there was no work. Stroud sighed. He said there was always work. But he wasn't going to watch Orrin kill himself for $1 a day. He said if Orrin wanted help, real help, he'd give it. But Orrin had to ask. Orrin stood there in the cold, pride and desperation warring inside him. Asking for help felt like admitting defeat, like proving that Dr. Fitch and Nora and every voice that told him not to go had been right. But refusing help felt like choosing death for no reason other than stubbornness. And maybe that's all it was. Maybe he'd come west to die on his own terms, and this was just the final stage. Or maybe, and this was the harder thought, maybe survival mattered more than pride. Maybe living, even with help, even with compromise, was worth more than dying pure and alone. He looked at Stroud, at the wood stacked high, at the cabin with smoke rising from the chimney, at the proof that a man could make it here if he was smart and careful and willing to bend. And Orrin asked. He asked for help. Stroud didn't gloat, didn't lecture. He just nodded and said they'd start tomorrow. Over the next 2 weeks, Stroud taught Orrin what he should have known from the beginning: how to dig a proper fire pit, how to bank coals so they'd last through the night, how to stack wood so it stayed dry, how to insulate the shelter with sod, cutting blocks from the creek bank, hauling them back, layering them against the juniper frame to create walls that would actually hold heat. It was brutal work. Orrin's body screamed at him, his lungs filled with dust, his hands split and bled. But Stroud worked alongside him, never faster than Orrin could manage, never making him feel weak. And slowly, the shelter changed. It stopped looking like a pile of sticks. It started looking like a structure, like something that might, possibly, keep a man alive. Mary brought food some days, bread, stew. Once, a whole roasted chicken that Orrin ate over 3 days, savoring every bite. She didn't ask for anything in return, didn't pry, just left the food and rode away. Orrin didn't know how to thank her, didn't know how to express what it meant to be seen, to be helped, to be treated like a human being instead of a ghost. So he just worked harder, tried to prove he was worth the effort, tried to show that he could survive, that he wasn't just waiting to die. By late October, the shelter had 4 sod walls, a reinforced roof, and a door made from scrap lumber Stroud had given him. It wasn't beautiful, it wasn't warm, but it was sealed. It would hold. Orrin stood inside it one evening, fire crackling in the pit, and felt something he hadn't felt since Pittsburgh. Not hope, exactly, but the absence of despair. He'd made it through summer, through the heat and the blood and the loneliness. He'd made it to fall, and now, with walls around him and wood stacked outside, he thought, maybe he could make it through winter, too. He wasn't cured, wasn't strong, but he was still here, still breathing, still fighting, and that was enough. For now, it was enough. The first real snow came in early November, heavy, silent, relentless. Orrin woke to a world gone white, the landscape erased, the sky and ground blending into a single pale nothing. He stood in the doorway of his shelter and watched it fall, thick flakes drifting down like ash. The cold bit through his coat. His breath plumed in the air. His chest tightened with every inhale. But he didn't go back inside. Not yet. He stood there, watching winter arrive, and thought about the choice he'd made. The choice to come. The choice to stay. The choice to ask for help. None of them had been easy. None of them had been clean. But they were his, and now he'd live with them, or die with them. Either way, they were his. Winter didn't arrive all at once. It came in stages, each one colder and harder than the last. November was bearable. Cold, yes, but manageable. The sod walls held. The fire kept the worst of the chill at bay. Orrin learned to sleep close to the coals, wrapped in his blanket and the extra wool coat Stroud had given him. An old one, patched and worn, but thick enough to matter. He learned to ration firewood, burning only what he needed, letting the cold creep in at night until it forced him awake to feed the flames. He learned the rhythm of winter survival. Wake, rebuild the fire, melt snow for water, eat sparingly, conserve energy, sleep, repeat. It was a small life. A quiet life, but it was life. The blood still came. Some mornings worse than others. He'd wake coughing, taste copper, spit into a rag he kept by the fire. The rag was stiff with old blood now, frozen in the mornings, thawed by the heat. He didn't wash it. There was no point. He just used it, and folded it, and set it aside, and tried not to think about what it meant. His body was failing. He knew that. The altitude hadn't made him stronger. The work hadn't cured him. Dr. Fitch had been right about that. But the doctor had been wrong about one thing. Orrin was still alive. Sick, yes. Dying, probably, but alive. And every morning he woke up was a morning Dr. Fitch hadn't predicted. December came down like a fist. The temperatures dropped below freezing and stayed there. The snow piled up in drifts against the shelter, covering the door halfway, blocking the light. Orrin had to dig himself out every morning, shovel in hand, clearing a path, just to reach the woodpile. The work left him gasping, bent double, coughing into the snow until it was speckled red. But he did it, because the alternative was being buried, and he hadn't come this far to be buried. The isolation deepened. He hadn't seen Stroud since mid-November. The snow made travel impossible. The roads, if they could be called that, were gone, erased under white. Orrin was alone again, truly alone. No voices, no faces, just wind and cold and the sound of his own breathing. He talked to himself more, not conversation, just words, reminders, instructions. Get up, feed the fire, eat something, don't stop moving. The sound of his own voice kept him tethered, kept him from drifting too far into the silence. Food became a problem. He'd stockpiled what he could, flour, beans, a little salt pork. But it wasn't enough. He'd underestimated how much he'd need, or maybe he'd just been too poor to buy more. Either way, by mid-December he was rationing hard, 1 meal a day, sometimes less. He boiled beans until they were soft, mashed them into a paste, ate them slowly to make them last. He made flour cakes on a flat stone by the fire, thin and bland, but filling enough to quiet the hunger for a few hours. He melted snow for water, drinking it lukewarm, tasting minerals and ash. His body shrank. His ribs pressed against his skin like bars, his face hollowed out. When he caught his reflection in the tin cup, he barely recognized himself. He looked like the men he'd seen in Pittsburgh, the dying men, the ones who coughed in doorways and slept in alleys and disappeared without anyone noticing. Christmas came and went without acknowledgement. Orrin didn't know the date, didn't care. Time had stopped meaning anything beyond light and dark, warm and cold, alive and dead. He thought about Nora that day. Or maybe it was a different day. He couldn't be sure. Thought about her children, probably opening small gifts, probably warm by a stove, probably safe. He wondered if she thought about him, if she mourned him, if she assumed he was dead. He probably should write, should send word. But he had no paper, no ink, no energy to walk to town, even if the snow allowed it. So he sat by the fire and let the thought pass. Let it join all the other thoughts that came and went, like ghosts. January 1877 arrived brutal and unforgiving. The cold was deeper now, sharper, the kind that didn't just chill. It cut. Orrin's hands cracked and bled from the dryness. His lips split no matter how much snow he melted and drank. His feet ached with a cold that never fully left, even by the fire. He wrapped them in strips of cloth, layered his socks, kept them as close to the flames as he dared. It helped. A little, but not enough. The coughing grew worse. Constant now, deep and rattling, like something breaking apart inside him. He coughed so hard some nights he couldn't sleep. couldn't lie down without choking. He sat propped against the sod wall, blanket around his shoulders, and waited for dawn, waited for the light to give him a reason to keep going. He started to think about leaving, not in a clear, decisive way, just in flashes, moments of weakness when the cold pressed too hard and the hunger bit too deep and the coughing left him breathless and shaking. He thought about walking to town, finding a room, spending his last dollars on warmth and food and a bed that wasn't frozen ground. He thought about writing Nora, asking her to send money for a train ticket, going back to Pittsburgh, admitting he'd failed, admitting Dr. Fitch had been right. It would be so easy. Just stand up, walk away, let someone else deal with the claim. Let the land office auction it off to the next fool who thought he could survive. No one would blame him. No one even knew he was out here. He could disappear, and it wouldn't matter. Except it would. It would matter to him. That's what kept him from leaving. Not pride, exactly. Something quieter, something closer to spite. He'd told Dr. Fitch he wouldn't die in a rented room. He'd told Nora he'd rather die free. And those words, spoken months ago in anger and desperation, had become a kind of anchor, a contract with himself. He didn't have to succeed, didn't have to prove up, didn't have to make the land bloom or build an empire or become the kind of homesteader the newspapers celebrated. He just had to not quit. That was the only victory left. The only thing that mattered, not quitting. So he didn't. He woke every morning, fed the fire, ate what little he had, and stayed. In late January, the weather broke for a few days. The sun came out pale and weak, but present. The temperature rose just enough to soften the snow. Orrin stepped outside and felt warmth on his face for the first time in weeks. It was fleeting. Fragile, but it was there. He stood in the doorway and looked at his claim, at the snow-covered ground, at the shelter that had kept him alive, at the smoke rising from his chimney into a sky that was, for the moment, clear. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't what he'd imagined when he filed the claim, but it was his. He'd paid for it in blood and cold and loneliness. And it was still standing. So was he. Stroud appeared that afternoon, riding slow through the snow on a horse that looked as tired as Orrin felt. He dismounted and walked to the shelter, knocked once, and stepped inside without waiting for an answer. He looked at Orrin for a long moment, taking in the weight loss, the hollowed eyes, the blood-stained rag by the fire. He didn't say anything at first, just set down a sack he'd been carrying. Inside was bread, dried meat, a jar of preserves. Orrin stared at it like it was a miracle. Stroud said Mary had been worried, said the snow had kept him away longer than he'd wanted, said he'd come as soon as the roads cleared enough to ride. He asked how Orrin was managing. Orrin almost laughed. Managing. That was one word for it. He said he was still here. Stroud nodded. He said that counted for something. They didn't talk much after that. Stroud checked the woodpile, said it was holding up, checked the walls, said they'd done good work. He asked if Orrin needed anything else. Orrin shook his head. He had what he needed. Food now, thanks to Stroud, fire, shelter. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Stroud stayed for an hour, sitting by the fire, not saying much, just present. And when he left, Orrin felt the loneliness settle back in like a weight. But it was a different weight now, lighter somehow, because he knew he wasn't completely forgotten. Someone had ridden through snow to check on him. Someone cared if he lived or died. That mattered, more than he'd expected. February came in quieter. The storms eased. The cold persisted, but without the vicious edge it had carried in January. Oren's body stabilized, not improved, but stabilized. The coughing continued, the blood continued, but he learned to work around it, learned his limits, learned when to push and when to rest. He started thinking past winter, started thinking about spring, about planting, even though he knew nothing about farming, about repairs, about the 12-month mark, about proving up. He wasn't there yet, wasn't close, but he could see it now, could see the finish line, even if it was still far off. And that gave him something he hadn't had before. Not hope, but direction, a reason to wake up, a reason to keep the fire burning. One morning in late February, he woke without coughing. It was the first time in months. He lay still, almost afraid to move, afraid the coughing would start the moment he sat up. But it didn't. His chest felt clear, his breathing steady. It wouldn't last. He knew that by afternoon the cough would return, harsh and familiar. But for that one morning, lying in his shelter with weak sunlight filtering through the gaps in the door, he felt almost normal, almost human. He closed his eyes and let himself imagine it. Imagine a future where he survived this, where he proved up, where he stood on this land in a year, 2 years, 5, and called it home. It was a fragile dream, built on nothing but stubbornness and spite, but it was his, and no one could take it from him. March arrived with mud and wind. The snow melted in uneven patches, leaving the ground soggy and treacherous. Water pooled in low spots, turning the paths Oren had worn into shallow streams. The world smelled like thaw, earth and rot, and something almost green underneath. It wasn't spring yet, not really, but it was the promise of spring. The days grew longer, the sun climbed higher. The cold still bit at night, but during the day, if the wind was calm, Oren could stand outside without his coat and feel warmth seep into his bones. It felt like resurrection, like waking from a dream he'd thought would never end. He'd survived winter, barely, by margins so thin they didn't bear thinking about. But he'd survived. The claim looked different in the melting light, smaller, somehow, more real. The shelter stood solid, sod walls dark with moisture, roof sagging slightly but intact. The woodpile had dwindled to almost nothing. A few pieces left, enough for another week, maybe. The fire pit outside was a black scar in the mud. The ground around the shelter was trampled and bare, packed down by months of pacing, of fetching wood, of digging through snow. It looked like a place where someone lived. Not comfortably, not well, but lived. That was something. He walked the property slowly, legs weak, lungs pulling at the thinner air. He looked at the land he'd claimed. 160 acres of scrub grass and hard dirt and emptiness. He still didn't know what to do with it. Still had no plan for cultivation, no vision for a farm or a ranch or anything resembling prosperity. But it was his. For 8 more months, if he could hold on, it would be his forever. The blood still came, but less frequently now. Or maybe he'd just stopped noticing it the way he used to. It had become part of the routine. Wake, cough, spit, move on. His body had reached some kind of equilibrium with the disease, not healing, not defeating it, just coexisting. The tuberculosis was still there, eating away at him from the inside. But it was eating slower now. Or maybe he'd learned to live with less lung capacity. Learned to move in ways that didn't trigger the worst of it. Learned to breathe shallow and careful, and accept that he'd never take a full, clean breath again. It was a compromise. His body and the altitude and the sickness, all negotiating terms, and somehow, impossibly, He was still standing. Stroud came by in early March, riding through mud that sucked at his horse's hooves. He brought seed, not much, a small sack of oats, another of turnips. He said Orrin should try planting, said the land office would want to see some evidence of cultivation when the inspector came. Orrin took the seed, held the rough burlap in his hands, and felt the weight of expectation settle on him again. He didn't know how to plant, didn't know when or where, or how deep. Stroud must have seen it on his face because he didn't leave. He stayed, showed Orrin how to break the soil, what little could be broken, showed him how to make shallow furrows, how to space the seed, how to cover it and press it down and hope. It was simple work, back-breaking but simple. And when they finished, Orrin looked at the small plot, maybe 20 feet by 30, barely a scratch on the claim, and felt something like accomplishment. It wasn't much, but it was more than he'd had. April brought rain, real rain, not snow, not the dry dust storms of summer. Actual rain that soaked into the ground and made things grow. Orrin stood outside his shelter and let it fall on him, face tilted up, mouth open, tasting it. Clean, cold, alive. The oats sprouted first, thin green shoots pushing up through the mud like needles. Then the turnips. Orrin checked them every day, crouching in the dirt, counting the plants, watching for growth. It was absurd, obsessive, but it gave him something to care about beyond his own failing body. Something that depended on him, something that might, if he was lucky, actually survive. The plants grew slowly. Some died. The soil was poor, the sun too harsh, but enough lived, enough to prove he'd tried, enough to show the land office he wasn't just squatting. He was working, improving, building something. By late April, Orrin had been on the claim for nearly a year. 11 months. The anniversary crept up on him. He hadn't been counting days, but when he thought back to early May 1876, stepping off the stage in Colorado Springs, walking to the land office, signing his name, it felt like a lifetime ago. He'd been a different person then. Thinner, yes, but also softer, more afraid, less certain of what he could endure. That man wouldn't recognize the one standing here now, wouldn't recognize the blood-stained rags or the sod walls or the careful, measured breaths, wouldn't recognize the quiet pride of having survived something most people said was impossible. Orrin had come west to die on his own terms. He'd succeeded at that, in a way. He was dying, slower than Dr. Fitch predicted, but still dying. The tuberculosis hadn't gone anywhere, but he was doing it here, on land that was his, under a sky so wide it made the dying feel smaller, less final. Just one more thing the West demanded. Stroud rode out in early May. He looked at the oat shoots, now several inches tall, looked at the turnip greens, looked at the shelter and the cleared ground, and the evidence of a year's hard living. He asked Orrin when the inspector was scheduled to come. Orrin said he didn't know. The land office had said 12 months. That was all. Stroud nodded. He said Orrin had done enough. Said most men wouldn't have made it this far. Said the ones who did weren't always the strongest or the smartest, just the ones too stubborn to quit. Orrin smiled at that. Stubborn. Yeah, that sounded right. Stroud didn't stay long, just long enough to say what needed saying, that Orrin had proven something. Maybe not to the land office, maybe not to anyone else, but to himself. And that was the only proof that mattered. The inspector came on a Tuesday, in mid-May. A thin man with spectacles and a clipboard, riding a government horse, looking tired and indifferent. He walked the claim without speaking, examined the shelter, looked at the crops, checked his map against the boundaries. He asked a few questions. How long Orrin had been here, what improvements he'd made, whether he intended to stay. Orrin answered simply, honestly, 12 months. Shelter, crops, cleared land. Yes, he intended to stay. The inspector wrote everything down in careful script. He said the claim looked sufficient, said the paperwork would be filed in 6 to 8 weeks, said Orrin would receive a patent once the full 5 years were complete, but the first year was approved, and then he left. Just like that. No ceremony, no congratulations. Just a man on a horse disappearing into the heat shimmer of a Colorado afternoon. Orrin stood in front of his shelter and watched him go. He waited until the inspector was completely out of sight before he let himself feel it. Relief. Not joy, not triumph, just relief. He'd done it. Survived 12 months. Proven residence. The land was his now, at least provisionally. He still had 4 more years before the patent came through. 4 more years of winters and summers and blood and loneliness. But he'd crossed the first threshold, the one everyone said he wouldn't reach. He looked at the claim, at the scrubby oat shoots and the patched sod walls and the bare dirt where he'd walked the same path 1,000 times. It wasn't much. It would never be much. But it was his, and he was still alive to see it. That night he built a fire outside, even though the weather was warm and he didn't need it. He just wanted to sit by flames under an open sky and feel the year settle into his bones. He thought about Pittsburgh, about Dr. Fitch's office and the rain on the window, and the sentence of slow death delivered in clinical terms. He thought about Nora, probably still believing he was dead. He thought about the train west and the first sight of the mountains and the moment he'd stepped onto this ground and claimed it. He thought about every frozen morning, every coughing fit, every moment he'd wanted to quit and hadn't. He didn't regret it. Not the choice to come. Not the suffering. Not the cost. Because the cost had bought him something no amount of comfort could have given him. It had bought him the right to choose. To fail or succeed on his own terms. To live or die in a place he'd picked. That was worth more than a clean bill of health. Worth more than safety. Worth more than the years Dr. Fitch might have given him if he'd stayed. The fire burned low. The stars came out thick and bright. The same stars he'd stared at that first night, terrified and alone. He wasn't terrified anymore. Still alone, yes. Still sick. Still uncertain of what came next. But not terrified. The West had tested him. The altitude and the cold and the silence and his own failing body had all conspired to break him. And he'd bent. He'd bled. He'd asked for help when pride said not to. He'd survived on the kindness of a neighbor and the stubbornness of a man who'd run out of reasons to quit. He hadn't won. The tuberculosis was still there. The land was still hard. The future was still uncertain. But he was still here, and that, somehow, was enough. Orrin Maddox didn't cure himself in the Colorado high country. He didn't transform into the man the land office pamphlets promised. Strong, prosperous, independent. He learned instead that survival wasn't about strength. It was about endurance, about waking up one more time, about choosing every single day to keep breathing, even when breathing hurt. The West didn't save him. It just gave him a place to be broken honestly, to suffer without pretense, to die, if that's what came, under a sky that didn't care but also didn't judge. 12 months had taught him what a lifetime in the city never could. That freedom wasn't comfort. that dignity wasn't ease, that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was admit you needed help and keep going anyway. He sat by the fire until it died to embers, and then he went inside his shelter, lay down on ground that was his, and slept. Have you ever chosen something difficult because staying comfortable felt like surrender? Have you ever kept going when every reasonable voice told you to stop? Share your story in the comments. I want to know what kept you moving when everything else said quit.